The notification came at 6:43 in the morning, before I had finished my first cup of coffee. It arrived not as a message, not as a call, but as a physical envelope slid under my apartment door. Cream-colored paper, heavy stock, sealed with a wax stamp I recognized immediately because I had spent 11 years studying it. The crest of the Interstellar Assembly. 7 interlocking rings pressed into dark green wax. I set down my coffee, picked up the envelope, and stood there in my kitchen in the early quiet of the morning, just holding it. My name was printed on the front in plain block letters. John Morrison, Administrative Coordinator, Earth Shipping Regulatory Office. No title beyond that. No rank. No honorific. Just my name and my job, same as it had been for 11 years, same as it would probably be for 11 more if the galaxy kept turning the way it always had. I opened it carefully, running my thumbnail along the seal rather than tearing the paper. The letter inside was 2 pages long. The first page was a formal notice of inquiry. The second page was a list of charges. I use that word loosely because they were not criminal charges. They were procedural challenges. The Assembly was informing me that my regulatory filing, submitted 14 weeks ago on behalf of Earth's independent shipping operators, had been flagged as non-compliant with Assembly procedural standards. I was being summoned to appear before the Assembly's Trade Arbitration Chamber to answer for it. I had 14 days to confirm my attendance, or the case would be transferred to an absence determination process, which in plain language meant they would rule without me present. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it along its original creases, put it back in the envelope, and finished my coffee. The filing they were upset about was not complicated in concept, even if it had taken me a long time to build. For 6 years, Earth's independent shipping operators had been subject to a set of trade restrictions that the Assembly called Standard Lane Management Protocols. In practice, those restrictions meant that human-operated cargo vessels were required to apply for reauthorization every 90 standard days to use certain transit corridors that ran through Assembly-designated space. The application process cost money, took time, and was routinely delayed without explanation. No other species with independent shipping infrastructure faced the same requirement. The restrictions had cost Earth's shipping sector an estimated 4.2 billion credits over the 6 years they had been in place, and they had cost individual operators something harder to calculate, which was the constant pressure of uncertainty, the not knowing whether this renewal cycle would go smoothly, or whether a delayed approval would ground their vessels for weeks, while competitors from full member worlds moved freely. I had filed a regulatory challenge 14 weeks ago, not on behalf of any government, not on behalf of any military body or diplomatic mission, on behalf of a coalition of 47 independent shipping operators who had pooled together enough credits to pay my office's filing fee and asked me to look into it. Most of them had not expected much. They were practical people, and they understood that the Assembly was not an organization that spent a great deal of time worrying about the concerns of provisional status civilizations with modest shipping operations. They had filed because they were out of other options, and because doing nothing had not been working. My supervisor had laughed when I told him what I was doing. He said the Assembly would bury it in committee, and we would never hear from them. He said I was wasting my time and should focus on the ordinary cases that needed attention. He was wrong about the hearing. We heard from them. They were not happy about what I had filed, and that unhappiness had arrived through my door in an envelope with a green wax seal. I took the transit pod to my office that morning and told my assistant, a young man named Callum Price who had been working with me for 3 years and who had the particular talent of knowing when to ask questions and when not to, that I had received a summons from the Assembly. He stared at me for a long moment and then asked me if I was going to withdraw the filing. I told him no. He nodded slowly, and I could see him making a calculation behind his eyes, the one that involved weighing what he knew about the Assembly against what he knew about me, and trying to figure out which of those two things should concern him more. I understood the look. The Interstellar Assembly was not a body that individual humans challenged through regulatory filings. It was a governing coalition of 19 species spread across 400 light-years of settled space. It had a standing judiciary, a permanent legislative chamber, a security apparatus, and a legal team that employed over 3,000 qualified attorneys across 12-member worlds. When the Assembly sent a summons to a mid-level administrative coordinator at a small regulatory office on Earth, the ordinary outcome was that the coordinator withdrew the filing, apologized for the inconvenience, and got on with their day. What Callum did not know, and what my supervisor did not know, and what the Assembly absolutely did not know, was that I had not filed that challenge on a guess. I had not filed it because I was angry about the restrictions, though I thought they were unjust. I had not filed it because someone had pressured me into it or because I was trying to prove something. I had filed it because I had spent 2.5 years building a case so careful, so thoroughly documented, so precisely grounded in the Assembly's own founding language, that I had become quite certain before I ever submitted the first page that the filing was correct. Not probably correct, not arguably correct, correct. I had read every founding document the Assembly had ever published. I had read every trade treaty, every transit corridor agreement, every addendum, every revised schedule, every procedural update issued in the last 80 years. I had read documents that predated the Assembly's current charter by 60 years. I had read the notes from the original formation conferences, the working drafts, the revision logs, the minority position statements that had been outvoted but preserved in the record as required by the Assembly's own transparency commitments. I had read the Assembly's internal guidance documents on how its legal framework was supposed to operate, the materials produced for new member world legal staff that explained the hierarchy of rules and what took precedence over what. I had cross-referenced every restriction currently applied to Earth's shipping lanes against every rule the Assembly's own founders had written about how member-adjacent civilizations were to be treated during provisional status periods. Earth was not a full Assembly member. We held provisional status, which was a category the Assembly's own charter defined very carefully. Provisional status came with specific protections. Those protections were written into the founding documents in plain language, not buried in footnotes or dependent on interpretation. The trade restrictions that had been applied to Earth's shipping lanes for 6 years violated 4 of those protections directly, not indirectly, not arguably, directly, in the same language the Assembly had used when it wrote the rules in the first place. I had documented every single violation. I had cited every charter clause, every treaty article, every procedural guideline. I had cross-referenced the violations against the Assembly's own published enforcement records to show that no other provisional status civilization had ever been subject to equivalent restrictions. I had attached 260 pages of supporting documentation to a 40-page primary argument. I had checked the filing 3 times before submitting it, and a 4th time the week before the summons arrived. The Assembly's summons, I realized as I reread it that morning in my office, was not a sign that they had found a problem with my filing. It was a sign that they had read it and were unsettled by what they found. They were not calling me in to dismiss the challenge on procedural grounds. They were calling me in because they had no clean way to dismiss it, and they wanted to see what kind of person had written it. I spent the following 3 days preparing my response documents. I did not hire a lawyer. I did not contact Earth's diplomatic mission to the Assembly. I told Callum to hold my regular workload, cleared my schedule, and sat at my desk reviewing the full body of Assembly founding documents one more time. I was not looking for new arguments. I was checking that I had missed nothing in the procedural requirements for the appearance itself, the rules about what a petitioner was permitted to submit, what they were required to disclose, and how they were expected to conduct themselves during a formal hearing before the Trade Arbitration Chamber. I had not missed anything. The morning of the hearing, I wore a plain gray suit. I carried a briefcase containing one item, a bound copy of the document I had already submitted, 311 pages, indexed, tabbed, and annotated in the margins in my own handwriting across weeks of careful review. I took the transit pod to the Assembly's regional chamber, a building made of dark gray stone and polished metal that sat on the edge of the city's interspecies district. I had walked past it many times over the years. I had never been inside. The security officer at the entrance asked me to state my name and purpose. I told him my name and said I had a hearing before the Trade Arbitration Chamber at 1000 hours. He checked his screen, looked up at me, looked back at his screen, and told me to follow the yellow line on the floor to Room 7. Room 7 was not a small room. It had a raised platform at one end where 9 adjudicators would sit. 3 were human legal representatives appointed by the Assembly's Human Liaison Office. The other 6 were from member species. I recognized their species by general appearance but did not know their names yet. I sat at the single table placed on the floor below the platform. There was no second table because this was not that kind of proceeding. The Assembly itself was the opposing party, and its legal team was represented by a senior coordinator named Adria Home, whom I had never met, who took a seat at a smaller desk near the wall to my left. She glanced at me when she sat down. She was a human woman in her 50s with short silver hair and a controlled expression. She looked at my briefcase. She looked at my suit. She looked at my face with the careful attention of someone making a quick, professional assessment. Then she looked back at her own documents. The 9 adjudicators entered at exactly 1000 hours. The chamber fell quiet. The lead adjudicator, a tall Vorath official with pale gray skin and 4-fingered hands, read out the formal notice of the hearing in Assembly standard language and then in translated English. He stated my name. He stated the filing number. He stated the nature of the challenge. Then he looked down at me from the platform and asked what the basis of the human petitioner's claim was regarding the misapplication of Assembly protocols. I stood. I said that the basis was contained in the bound document I had already submitted as part of the filing, and that I had brought a physical copy if the chamber wished to refer to it during the session. There was a pause. The lead adjudicator looked at the member to his right. That member looked at the member to his left. Adria Home, at her desk near the wall, was very still. The lead adjudicator asked if I had any introductory remarks before the chamber began its questions. I said I did not. I said everything I had to say was in the document. Another pause, long enough to hear the quiet hum of the building's air circulation. He said the chamber would recess to review the submitted materials in full before proceeding with questions. He asked if I was available to return the following morning. I said I was. The session had lasted 11 minutes. I picked up my briefcase, nodded to the chamber, and walked out. Callum called me on the way home. He asked how it went. I told him we were returning tomorrow. He asked what had happened. I told him they needed to read the document. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he thought this might be bigger than he had originally understood. I told him to clear my schedule for the rest of the week. He said he would. When I got home, I made dinner, reviewed my notes one more time, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. I was not nervous. I had done the work. Whatever was going to happen next was already written in the pages of that filing, and it had been written there for 14 weeks. The Assembly just had not finished reading yet. I was back in Room 7 at 1000 hours the next morning. I sat at the same table. I set my briefcase in the same spot on the floor beside my chair. I straightened my folder of supplementary notes and placed my pen beside it. The chamber was quieter than it had been the day before, and the silence carried a different quality. Yesterday, the silence had been the kind that settles naturally in a room where powerful people expect a meeting to be brief and uncomplicated. Today, the silence had weight. It pressed against the walls, and sat behind the eyes of every person on the platform. The 9 adjudicators filed in and took their places. I watched each of them as they arranged themselves and settled into their chairs. 2 of the human representatives did not look at me at all when they sat down, which itself told me something about what kind of evening they had spent in this building. One of the Voreth members had brought a physical copy of my document with him to the chamber. He set it on the platform, and the pages had been marked with multiple colored tabs along the top edge. I counted 9 tabs from where I sat. I had used 12 in my own annotated copy. They were close, and that closeness meant they had read with genuine care. Adria Holm was at her desk to my left. This morning she had a second thick document open beside her primary folder, and she had been writing in it when I came in. She stopped writing when the adjudicators entered. Whatever she had done the night before, she had not spent it resting. Adjudicator Cavell, the lead member who had presided over yesterday's session, called the hearing to order. He said the chamber had spent the previous evening and the earlier part of this morning reviewing the submitted filing in its entirety. He said the review had been thorough. He said the chamber had a number of questions and wished to proceed through them methodically. He asked me to remain standing for the duration of the questioning period. I said I was able to do that. Cavell looked at the document in front of him. He had tabbed it himself, in a different color from the member seated beside him. He opened to one of those tabs and said the filing made reference to Article 17 of the Assembly's Provisional Civilization Accord, specifically subsection 4, which outlined the conditions under which transit corridor access could be modified for non-member civilizations during provisional status periods. He said the chamber wished to understand clearly why I believed that provision applied in the way the filing claimed. I said it was because the Accord was a founding document, and the Lane Management Protocol was a directorate-level administrative instrument, and the difference between those two categories was not a matter of age or seniority, but of constitutional authority. Under the Assembly's own constitutional hierarchy, as established in the Charter of Formation, founding documents held precedence over all directorate-level instruments in matters concerning the treatment of non-member civilizations. That precedence was not implicit or inferred. It was stated directly in the Charter of Formation's hierarchy provisions. The Lane Management Protocol would have required ratification at the full legislative chamber level to legally apply to provisions covered by the Accord. It had not been ratified at that level. It had been issued as an internal directorate order, which gave it full authority over internal Assembly shipping operations, but not the constitutional weight required to override protections the Accord had guaranteed to provisional status civilizations. Cavell was quiet for a moment. Then Adjudicator Varon, the Karun representative to his far right with pale gold skin and wide dark eyes, leaned forward and asked how I had located the Charter of Formation's hierarchy provisions. She said that section of the Charter was not indexed in the standard Assembly reference database available to external parties. She asked it without hostility, but the question itself carried a point. She was asking whether I had accessed something I should not have had access to. I said I had found it in the original published volumes of the Assembly's founding conference records, which had been placed in the public physical archive of the Interspecies Library on Meridian Station over 60 years ago, and had been available to any party who wished to read them ever since. I said I had spent 3 weeks reading them approximately 4 years ago during a period of annual leave, arranged specifically for that purpose. She sat back slowly, in the way a person sits back when they have just confirmed something they suspected, but did not want to believe until they heard it stated plainly. I continued before the next question arrived. I said that subsection 4 of Article 17 was not the only provision at issue. The filing had identified 4 separate areas of conflict between the Lane Management Protocol's application to Earth's operators and the protections guaranteed under the Accord. I asked whether the chamber wished to proceed through each point in sequence. Cavell conferred briefly with the members beside him in assembly standard language, which came through my earpiece as a low murmur. He turned back and said the chamber would hear each point in sequence. He said to take whatever time was necessary. I set my briefcase on the table, opened it, and placed my annotated copy of the filing in front of me. I did not open it to any particular page. I had memorized the relevant sections. The physical copy was there in case a specific clause needed to be confirmed for the chamber's record. I began with the first point. I walked through the language of the Provisional Civilization Accord's Transit Rights Protections clause by clause. I cited the specific article and subsection numbers. I placed the language of the Accord's protections directly alongside the operational text of the Lane Management Protocol, and showed where the protocol's language directly contradicted what the Accord had guaranteed. I spoke clearly, and moved to the next point when I was finished with the one before. The second point concerned the non-discrimination requirement embedded in the Assembly's foundational charter. That provision stated plainly that administrative instruments could not be applied selectively to provisional status civilizations without documented evidence on file of a specific threat or disruption caused by that civilization's operations. I had spent a significant part of the research phase reviewing 6 years of Assembly Trade Directorate records looking specifically for that documentation. It did not exist. The Lane Management Protocol had been applied to Earth's shipping operators without any stated justification beyond a general reference to lane management efficiency. General lane management efficiency was not a valid basis under the Charter for differential treatment applied to a specific provisional status civilization, while others of equivalent status operated freely. I paused and asked if the chamber wished me to read the specific language of the non-discrimination provision aloud. Cavell said that would not be necessary. He said the chamber was fully familiar with the provision. I moved to the third point. The third point was the one I had thought about most carefully during the months of preparation, because it was not simply an argument about whether the restrictions were improperly applied. It was about something that had happened quietly inside the Assembly's own system 4 years ago and had been sitting there ever since, waiting for someone to find it. In the Assembly Trade Directorate's internal review records, dated approximately 2 years after the Lane Management Protocol was first applied to Earth's operators, a Directorate legal analyst had flagged the non-discrimination question. That analyst had submitted a formal internal query asking whether the protocol's application to Earth's shipping operators had been reviewed against the requirements of the Provisional Civilization Accord before the application began. The query had been received by the Directorate's administrative system. It had been assigned a reference number. It had been logged as open. It had received no response. It was still open in the Directorate's own records 4 years later, because I had checked the transparency log the week before this hearing to confirm that nothing had changed. I had found it in the Assembly's published Administrative Transparency Log. The Assembly maintained that log as a matter of charter obligation. It was public. It had been available for anyone to read for the entire period the query sat open. I was, as far as I could determine, the first person outside the Assembly's staff who had read it carefully enough to notice what was there. When I presented this point, the chamber went very still. Adria Holmes stopped writing. Her pen was in her hand, and her hand was on her notepad, and neither moved. I gave the reference number of the unanswered query. I gave the date it was filed. I gave the date of the most recent status note attached to it, which was a routine log update confirming the query remained open without addressing it. I said the existence of this query in the Directorate's own records was significant in a specific way. It meant that the potential conflict between the Lane Management Protocol and the Provisional Civilization Accord had been identified internally by the Assembly's own staff more than 4 years before my filing arrived. It had not been resolved. It had not been closed. It had simply been left there while the restrictions continued to be applied. That meant that for 4 full years, Earth's operators had been paying fees and absorbing delays under a protocol that the Assembly's own internal process had flagged as potentially problematic, without that flag ever being addressed by anyone in a position to address it. I let that information sit in the room for a moment. Then I moved to the fourth point. The fourth point was procedural. Under the Accord's dispute resolution framework, a provisional state of civilization had the explicit right to challenge trade restrictions through a formal regulatory filing without those restrictions being escalated or expanded during the review period. The framework's language on this was direct. Non-escalation during an active challenge was a guaranteed protection, not a courteous practice. I referenced the date my challenge had been filed, 14 weeks ago. I then referenced a Trade Directorate notice issued and published 6 weeks after my filing, which had extended the reauthorization interval for Earth's operators from 90 standard days to 60 standard days. That extension had the direct practical effect of tightening the restrictions while my challenge was actively under review. It was a documented violation of the Accord's non-escalation provision. The timing was on record in the Directorate's own published notices, and the provision it violated was written in plain language in the dispute resolution framework. I closed my annotated copy. I said I had no further points to present. I said everything else was documented in the filing, including the financial appendix calculating the total economic impact on the 47 operators across the 6-year period. The chamber was quiet for a long time after I finished. Cavell looked at his document. He looked at the member beside him. He looked at me. He asked me how long I had been preparing this filing. I said 2.5 years. He absorbed that. Then he asked why I had not brought the challenge through Earth's diplomatic mission to the Assembly rather than through a direct regulatory filing. I said the filing was a regulatory matter governed by specific provisions in the Accord itself. Earth's diplomatic mission operated under a separate framework designed for a different kind of communication. Bringing a charter-level regulatory challenge through the diplomatic channel would have been procedurally incorrect and would likely have resulted in the challenge being redirected anyway. The Accord specified the direct filing pathway for exactly this type of challenge, and I had followed it. He looked at me for a long moment. It was not a hostile look. It was the look of someone recalibrating quietly. He said the chamber would recess for deliberation. He said I would receive formal notification when the next session date was confirmed. I thanked the chamber. I stood, picked up my briefcase, and walked out of room 7 into the corridor. The young staff member who had escorted me to the exit the previous day was waiting again. We walked in silence to the building's entrance. At the door he stopped. I kept walking. Outside, the air was cooler than it had been the day before. I walked to the transit pod station at the corner. My phone buzzed. Callum. He asked how it went. I told him the chamber was deliberating and that we would be notified when the next session was scheduled. He asked if it had gone well. I told him I had presented all 4 points without interruption and that no counterargument had been offered in response to any of them. I said that when a chamber asks a petitioner how long they spent preparing a filing and then says nothing at all after the answer, it is usually because the answer has changed their understanding of what they are dealing with. He was quiet for a second. Then he asked if I needed anything from the office. I told him to have the full case file ready in the morning and to hold my regular calendar through the rest of the week. I ended the call and got on the pod. The city moved past the window. I watched it and did not think about much. The filing was submitted. The arguments were made. Everything that was going to happen had already been determined by the words on those 311 pages. What remained now was simply time. 4 days passed without any message from the chamber. I spent those days answering the ordinary cases that had accumulated during the weeks I had given to preparation. A freight classification dispute. A compliance notice issued in error that needed formal correction. A question from a new operator who had not understood which form applied to their route registration. I answered each one in turn and did not spend much time thinking about what was happening across the city. I had done what I could do. The rest was not in my hands. On the fifth day, a message arrived through the Assembly's formal communication system. It was not a hearing date. It was a request for clarification on a specific citation. The Chamber's administrative office asked me to confirm the source of my reference to the Charter of Formation's hierarchy provisions, specifically the volume and page number from the Meridian Station archive. I replied the same afternoon with the volume number, the chapter, the page range, and the archive call number. I also included scanned copies of the relevant pages, which I had photographed during my weeks at the Meridian Station Library 4 years ago, because I had understood even then, reading those volumes for the first time in the quiet of that archive, that a moment would eventually come when having those images would matter a great deal. On the sixth day, a second message arrived asking for the full reference trail for the internal directorate query I had cited in the third point of my presentation. They wanted the transparency log entry, the reference number, the log date, and confirmation of exactly where in the published transparency log the entry appeared, and how to navigate to it through the Assembly's public document portal. I sent the complete reference within the hour, including the direct navigation pathway and a copy of the specific portal entry. I had bookmarked it nearly 2 years ago. On the seventh day, a third message arrived. This one was different in origin and tone. It came from the Assembly's Office of Legal Standards, not from the Administrative Office. It asked whether I would be available for an informal meeting with a senior legal standards officer to discuss the scope of the filing. It specified clearly that the meeting was not a formal proceeding and would not be entered into the official case record. I read that message 3 times before I replied. An informal meeting not entered into the official record meant something precise in Assembly legal practice. I knew what it meant because I had read the procedural guidelines for legal standards officers during the second year of my research. Such a meeting was permitted for one primary purpose: to explore whether a matter could be resolved through administrative correction before the formal ruling concluded. In plain language, it was an offer to settle quietly before a public determination was issued. I replied that I was available, but that I wished to note for my own records that the meeting had been requested, and that I would be maintaining a personal log of its date, time, and content, as was my right under the Accord's transparency provisions for parties engaged in active charter-level challenges. The reply came back within 20 minutes. It confirmed the meeting time and made no comment about my note. The legal standards officer was a human woman named Petra Dunn. She met me in a small conference room on the 3rd floor of the Chamber building. The room was quiet and plain. Petra Dunn was a tall, composed woman in her early 40s, with the careful speech of someone who had spent years having conversations where every word carried consequence. She thanked me for coming. She said the Assembly was always open to constructive engagement with parties who raised concerns through proper channels. She said the Assembly was prepared to initiate an internal review of the lane management protocol's application to provisional status civilizations. The review would take 18 months and would directly address every concern raised in my filing. In exchange, the Assembly would ask that the current filing be placed in a paused status during the review period. I picked up the glass of water in front of me and took a small sip. I set it back down. I told her I had 3 questions. She said to go ahead. I asked whether the existing restrictions on Earth shipping operators would be suspended during the 18-month review period. She said that had not been proposed as part of the arrangement. I asked whether the review would be conducted by an independent external body or internally by the Trade Directorate itself. She said it would be conducted by an internal review panel appointed by the Trade Directorate. I asked my third question. I asked whether a directorate-level internal review panel would carry the constitutional authority necessary to resolve a charter-level question, specifically whether such a panel's findings could carry the weight of a founding document interpretation. She was still for just a moment. Then she said that was a procedural matter that would need to be addressed as part of the review's terms of reference. I said I understood. I said I would not be accepting the offer. She looked at me, not with frustration, not with surprise, with the careful attention of someone who had made a required offer and received the expected answer. I told her the filing was not a hostile act. I said I had no difficulty with the Assembly's legal staff or with her office. I said I had filed because the regulations were wrong under the Assembly's own rules, and the correct resolution was a ruling from the chamber on the merits. I said I would continue to appear for all scheduled sessions and respond to all legitimate procedural requests. She thanked me for my time. We shook hands. I walked back to the transit pod station. When I reached my office, Callum had a message waiting. It had arrived while I was in the meeting. The chamber had set the next hearing date, 11 days from now. The notice described it as a procedural review and expert determination proceeding. In Assembly legal terminology, an expert determination proceeding was what the chamber convened when the constitutional questions required independent external expertise before a ruling could be issued. The Assembly reserved that process for cases where the legal questions were serious enough that the adjudicators themselves wanted the analysis independently verified before committing it to a formal record. They did not convene expert determinations for minor matters. I told Callum to book me a review room for the next 10 days. I said I was going to read the filing one more time, every section, and ensure I had a complete answer ready for any question an expert panel might raise. He said he would set it up immediately. I opened the research terminal. Outside my window, the city moved at its ordinary pace. Nobody in the Assembly's building across the city knew quite what they had brought into their chambers when they sent a cream-colored envelope to a mid-level administrative coordinator who had read documents they had forgotten existed. But they were beginning to understand it now. The expert determination session was held in a larger chamber on the second floor of the Assembly's regional building, a room with a curved ceiling and tiered seating along the walls. When I arrived that morning, the chamber held more people than I had expected. The 9 adjudicators occupied the raised platform. Adria Home was at her desk, but along the side walls in the tiered seats, there were approximately 40 observers. Some wore Assembly staff uniforms. Several wore the formal attire of member species legal offices. A few carried plain identification badges I could not read from my table. I knew what their presence meant. Word had spread beyond this chamber and beyond this building. I sat down, set my briefcase beside my chair, and straightened my folder. I was aware of the observers in the side seating in the way you are aware of something that changes the meaning of a room without changing its layout. I had not asked for an audience, but I understood why one had gathered. The 3 external legal experts were introduced and seated at a long table to the right of the adjudicator's platform. The first was Professor Daniel Ware, a human legal scholar from the Institute of Interspecies Law at the University of Geneva. He was in his late 60s, white-haired, and he had the manner of someone who thought carefully before every sentence because he had learned over a long career that imprecise language in legal analysis caused problems downstream. I had read 2 of his published papers during my research and had cited one in a secondary footnote of the filing. He had not acknowledged that when we were introduced, which I appreciated. The second expert was Examiner Save Tal, a Voreth legal theorist who held a senior position at the Assembly's own Institute of Constitutional Affairs. The third was Scholar Preth, a Karun academic who specialized in the history of the Assembly's founding documents. That specialization was the one that mattered most to the arguments I had made, because the founding documents were where the case lived or did not live. Cavell opened the session. outlined the key questions to the experts, and asked them to present their independent analyses. He specified that each expert should speak only to their own assessment and should not coordinate their testimony with the other two. The chamber was quiet in the particular way that comes when many people are genuinely uncertain of what they are about to hear. Professor Ware spoke first. He had read the filing carefully. I could tell by the way he had organized his notes, which I could see from my table had been structured around the same four main points the filing was built on. His analysis was methodical and his language was exact. He addressed the hierarchy question directly and confirmed that under the Charter of Formation's structural framework, a directorate-level administrative instrument could not override a founding document protection unless it had been ratified at the full legislative level. He said this principle was not disputed anywhere in Assembly constitutional scholarship. It was established, foundational, and consistently applied in the cases where it had previously arisen. He said the operative question in this case was not whether the principle existed, but whether the lane management protocol had always been intended as an external-facing instrument, or whether it had originally been designed for internal traffic management, and had then been extended through administrative practice to cover provisional state as civilizations, without the ratification that such an extension would require under the constitutional hierarchy. He paused. He looked at the filing in front of him and then looked up. He said that based on the documentation provided, the case for improper extension through practice rather than proper legislative action appeared credible and substantiated. He said there was nothing in the record he had reviewed that contradicted that assessment. He said that was his independent conclusion. The room absorbed that. Examiner Save Tal spoke second. He addressed the non-discrimination provision. He spoke with the particular precision of someone who had spent years inside the Assembly's own legal institutions and understood their internal logic as well as their external documents. He confirmed that while the Assembly had legitimate authority to impose transit management requirements on non-member shipping operations, those requirements had to be applied uniformly across provisional status civilizations, or supported by documented justification for any differential treatment applied to a specific civilization. That justification had to be on file, specific, and related to an actual documented concern about that civilization's operations. He said he had reviewed the Trade Directorate's records as cited in the filing. He confirmed that no such documentation existed in the Directorate's file for the differential treatment applied to Earth. None. Not a partial justification. Not an internal memo that might have served as a precursor. Nothing that could be read as an attempt to document the reasoning. Then he addressed the unanswered internal query, and he took his time with it, because he understood it was the most significant element of the third point, and the one that required the most careful framing. He said it was important to understand precisely what the existence of that query meant in procedural terms. When a legal question was formally raised inside a directorate, assigned a reference number, and left without resolution, the continued actions taken in the same subject area afterward were not equivalent to actions taken before the question had ever been raised. That distinction was important. Before a question was raised, a body could act in good faith on the basis of its understanding of its own authority. After a question was raised internally and acknowledged with a reference number, that specific invocation of good faith became more complicated. The 4 years of continued application that followed an internally acknowledged and unresolved legal concern carried a heightened level of procedural vulnerability, because a formal external challenge could properly point to the unanswered query as evidence that the issue was not simply unforeseen, but had been noted and then set aside. He said this did not necessarily indicate bad intent on anyone's part. He said administrative records accumulated, internal queries got buried under workload, and things that should have been resolved were sometimes not. But the procedural effect was what it was regardless of intent. He looked at me when he finished saying that. I held his gaze without any particular expression. I had written that third point with care because I had known exactly what it meant when I found that query sitting open in the transparency log, and I had known exactly how it would read in a formal legal analysis. Scholar Preth spoke third. She was systematic and thorough. She confirmed that the archive at Meridian Station was a legitimate primary source, and that the volume and page citations I had provided in my clarification response matched the original documents she had independently verified. She confirmed the hierarchy provisions were authentic and had been present in the founding documents from the initial drafting conference, not introduced later through revision or amendment. She noted that those provisions had not been widely cited in modern assembly practice, because external challenges through this specific procedural pathway had been uncommon. Then she added something that had come from her own reading of the founding conference notes, rather than from anything in my filing, and it was something I had not included in my arguments, but that fit precisely within them. She said the founding conference notes contained explicit explanatory language from the original drafters. Those drafters had written about why they had made the Accord's protections robust against administrative modification, and their reasoning was recorded in the conference records alongside the provisions themselves. They had anticipated, in explicit terms, that administrative bodies would expand their operational scope over time in ways that might not consistently account for the rights of external parties. They had seen it happen in pre-assembly governance frameworks, and they had deliberately constructed the Accord's protections to be resistant to that kind of gradual erosion, precisely because they understood that erosion of that kind happened slowly, through small decisions that individually seemed reasonable and operationally convenient, until the protections existed only on paper, while the practical reality had moved somewhere else entirely without any single moment of obvious violation. The chamber was very quiet when she finished. Cavell asked the three experts directly whether their analysis, taken together, indicated that the challenge had constitutional merit. Professor Ware said yes without qualification. Examiner Save Tal said the constitutional questions were substantial and credible, and that the documentation supporting them was thorough and carefully sourced. Scholar Preth said the founding document record supported the interpretation advanced in the filing, and that she had reviewed the founding documents fully and found no language that contradicted it. 3 experts, 3 independent analyses, 3 confirmations. Cavell then turned to Adria Home and asked if the Assembly's legal office wished to present a counter-analysis. She stood. She was composed and precise in the way that very capable legal professionals are when they have nothing substantive left to argue, but are required to say something on the record. She said the Assembly's position was that the lane management protocol had been applied in good faith for the purpose of maintaining consistent and safe transit corridor operations. She acknowledged that the filing had raised procedural questions that merited careful review. She said the Assembly remained committed to working constructively with the Chamber to ensure that all applicable legal frameworks were properly considered going forward. She sat down. She had not argued that the protocol superseded the Accord. She had not argued that differential treatment was justified. She had not disputed a single factual point any of the 3 experts had made, because there was nothing to dispute. The filing was correct. The experts had confirmed it from 3 independent directions with 3 separate areas of expertise. Adria Home was a skilled legal professional doing her job with discipline, and her job in this moment was to say something professional and measured and not make the situation worse. Cavell turned to me and asked if I wished to make a closing statement. I stood. I said I had one matter to add. The 47 operators on whose behalf the filing had been made had been paying reauthorization fees and absorbing transit delays for 6 years. The total economic impact was documented in Appendix 3 of the filing. I would be requesting, as part of the Chamber's ruling, a determination on whether retrospective remedy was appropriate for costs incurred during the period of improper application. I said this not as a demand but as a matter of procedural completeness, because the Accord's dispute resolution framework permitted such a request, and I had included the relevant financial documentation to support it. Cavell said the Chamber would consider all matters raised in the filing and appendices. He thanked me and formally concluded the session. As people began to move in the chamber afterward, I noticed two of the observers in the side seating move close together and begin speaking in low voices, one of them typing rapidly on a handheld device. I did not know which member world offices they represented. I had a reasonable idea that whatever they were writing would travel quickly and would reach people in positions to be concerned about the implications of what had just been said in a formally convened expert determination proceeding on the record. Outside, Callum was waiting at the transit stop. He had stood in front of the building for 2 hours. He looked at my face when I came through the doors and did not say anything for a moment. He asked how it went. I told him all 3 external experts had independently confirmed that the filing had constitutional merit, and that no counterargument had been presented in response to any of the 3 expert analyses. He stared at me. He said all 3 of them. I said all 3, independently from 3 different areas of expertise, without any contradiction in the record. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said we should get some lunch. I said that was a very good idea. We walked 2 blocks to a small place with outdoor tables that served plain food without any fuss. I had soup. Callum had a sandwich. The afternoon moved around us in its ordinary way. I drank my soup and thought about the 47 operators who had pooled their filing fees and trusted me with the task. Most of them ran small operations. Families who planned their work 90 days at a time, and had spent 6 years watching those plans made harder by a bureaucratic requirement that had never been properly authorized in the first place. I thought about the analyst at the Trade Directorate who had filed an internal query 4 years ago and received nothing but a reference number and silence. They had asked the right question. Nobody had answered them. In a different room, through a different kind of proceeding, I had answered it for them in front of 9 adjudicators and 3 external experts and 40 observers. Callum finished his sandwich. He asked what happened next. I said we waited for the ruling. It might be several weeks. He nodded and did not ask anything more, and I appreciated that about him. He understood that the waiting was not a problem. The work was done. The rest would arrive when it arrived. 7 days after the expert determination session, a message arrived through the Assembly's formal communication system that was unlike any of the previous communications I had received during the case. It did not come from the Chamber's administrative office, and it was not a request for clarification on a citation. It came from the Assembly's Trade Directorate directly, addressed to me by name and by case reference number, and it described itself as a courtesy notification. The notification informed me that the Trade Directorate had appointed an internal working group to review the Lane Management Protocol's application framework. It said this review was a standard operational procedure that the Directorate undertook periodically to ensure its instruments remained current and appropriate. It said the working group would complete its assessment within 60 days and that its findings would be shared with the Chamber as a supplementary submission. I read the notification twice. Then I set it aside and went back to the case files I had been reviewing. An internal working group appointed by the same directorate that had issued the protocol, with a 60-day timeline that would land roughly when the Chamber was expected to issue its ruling, describing itself as a standard operational procedure that coincidentally began 7 days after 3 independent legal experts had confirmed constitutional problems with the protocol's application, was not a standard operational procedure. It was an attempt to insert a parallel process into the space where the Chamber's ruling would otherwise operate without competition. I drafted a response the same day. I noted the receipt of the notification for my records. I noted the timeline. I noted that the filing under active consideration by the Trade Arbitration Chamber concerned the constitutional validity of the protocol's application under the Accord's hierarchy provisions, and that a directorate-level internal review, whatever its findings, could not resolve a constitutional question that required determination at the appropriate level. I said I looked forward to the Chamber's ruling. I sent the response through the formal communication channel, so it would be on record. 3 days after that, a second message arrived. This one was from a different address within the Assembly's administrative structure, a unit I had not previously corresponded with, which identified itself as the Assembly's Interspecies Relations Coordination Office. The message expressed the office's awareness of the regulatory matter currently before the Trade Arbitration Chamber, and stated that the office was available to facilitate informal dialogue between the petitioner and relevant assembly bodies as a service to the process. I read that message carefully. An office I had never heard of, offering to facilitate informal dialogue, 3 days after I had responded on the record that a directorate-level review could not resolve a constitutional question, was an offer to redirect me into a conversation that would not produce a ruling. I replied politely that I was engaged with the formal chamber process and that any dialogue I participated in would be on the record as required by the Accord's transparency provisions. I thanked them for their awareness of the matter. I heard nothing from that office again. On the 14th day after the expert determination session, Callum came to my door and said he had received a call from a journalist at an interspecies news service asking for comment on the Morrison regulatory challenge. He said the journalist had described the case as one of the most significant constitutional challenges brought before the Trade Arbitration Chamber by a provisional status civilization in the current charter cycle. I told Callum to tell the journalist that I did not have any comment while the case was pending before the chamber, and that I appreciated their interest. He passed the message along and then came back and stood in my doorway for a moment. He said the fact that the press was asking about it was probably a sign of something. I told him it was a sign that the expert determination proceeding had been noted by people beyond the chamber, which was consistent with what I had observed when I saw the observers in the tiered seating. He asked if that changed anything. I said it did not change the filing or the arguments or what the chamber had to decide. I said external attention did not make a correct argument more correct or an incorrect one less so. The ruling would be what it was going to be based on the documents in front of the chamber. He said he supposed that was true. On the 22nd day after the expert determination session, a message arrived from the Assembly's Office of Legal Standards. It was addressed to me and marked as a formal communication in the case record, which meant it was different in nature from the informal meeting Petra Dunn had offered earlier in the process. This was on the record. The message stated that the Office of Legal Standards had completed an internal review of the matters raised in the Morrison regulatory challenge and wished to share certain observations with the petitioner before the chamber issued its determination. It stated that the office had identified several areas in which the Trade Directorate's administrative practices could benefit from clarification, and that steps were already being taken internally to address those areas. It stated that the office wished to convey its view that the concerns underlying the filing had been heard and were being taken seriously at the appropriate administrative level. I read that message 3 times. It was not an offer to settle. It was a formal, on-record statement that the Assembly was already addressing the concerns the filing had raised, delivered before the ruling came out, presumably so that it could be cited afterward as evidence that the ruling had been overtaken by internal action. It was careful and professional, and it was trying to manage the implications of a ruling that the office clearly expected to come down in a direction they would have preferred to avoid. I drafted my response the same evening. I acknowledged receipt of the communication. I noted that it appeared to describe internal administrative steps being taken by the Trade Directorate and the Office of Legal Standards. I said that internal administrative steps could not substitute for a constitutional determination by the Trade Arbitration Chamber on the questions raised in the filing, and that I remained confident the Chamber would issue its ruling on the merits in due course. I said the petitioner and the 47 operators on whose behalf the filing had been made looked forward to that ruling. I sent it through the formal channel, so it would be part of the case record. After I sent it, I sat at my desk for a moment and thought about all of it: the working group notification, the Interspecies Relations Coordination Office, the journalist, the formal on-record statement from Legal Standards. Each of these had arrived in sequence over the 22 days since the expert determination session. Each one had been a different kind of attempt to change the trajectory of a case that was moving toward a public ruling. None of them had been crude. All of them had been professional, and none of them had engaged with the substance of what the filing actually said, because the substance was not something they could argue against. That was the thing about building a case out of the Assembly's own founding documents. There was no external opponent to defeat. There was no argument about facts to be had. The records either said what they said or they did not, and in this case, they said exactly what the filing claimed they said. Every expert had confirmed it. Every request for clarification had been answered with the actual pages from the actual archive. The only thing the Assembly could do at this point was try to redirect, delay, or manage around a ruling they could see coming, and they were doing all three with considerable professional discipline. None of it changed anything. I went home that evening and made dinner and went to bed at a reasonable hour. The case was in the Chamber's hands. The Chamber would take whatever time it needed. I had done everything the filing required of me, and I had done it correctly. 9 days later, Callum knocked on my door frame and said there was a transmission from the Trade Arbitration Chamber. The ruling came on a Tuesday, 31 days after the expert determination session. It arrived through the Assembly's formal communication system at 11:47 in the morning. I was at my desk reviewing Arthur Cole's freight classification query when Callum knocked on my door frame and told me there was a transmission from the Trade Arbitration Chamber. I asked him to pull it up on the shared screen. The document was 14 pages. I read it from the beginning, every page in sequence, which is the only way to read a ruling you have spent 2.5 years working toward. The formal header filled the first page. The 9 adjudicators' names listed in order of seniority, the case reference number, the date. The subject line identified the matter as the determination in the Morrison regulatory challenge, filing reference 17-44, concerning the application of the Lane Management Protocol to Earth-registered provisional status shipping operators. Page 2 was the procedural summary, cataloging the hearing dates, the expert panel composition, the on-record communications received during the deliberation period, and the full list of materials the Chamber had considered in reaching its determination. My responses to the working group notification and the legal standards communication were listed there. They were on the record. Page 3 was where the ruling itself began. The Chamber had found, by a vote of 7-2, that the application of the Lane Management Protocol to Earth-registered shipping operators during the provisional status period constituted a violation of Article 17, subsection 4, of the Provisional Civilization Accord. The Chamber found that the protocol had not been ratified at the required legislative level for application to provisions governed by the Accord, and that its extension to provisional status civilizations through administrative practice rather than legislative action was constitutionally invalid. That was the central question of the filing. The Chamber had answered it clearly and on the record, and it would be there in the record from now on. The Chamber further found that the differential application of the protocol to Earth's operators without documented justification on file with the Trade Directorate, was inconsistent with the non-discrimination provisions of the Assembly's foundational charter. Page 4 addressed the unanswered internal query. The Chamber found that the existence of an unresolved legal concern in the Trade Directorate's own administrative record, sitting open for 4 years before the current challenge was filed, was a matter of significant internal compliance concern. The Chamber referred that matter to the Assembly's Office of Internal Standards for separate review and corrective action. It was a formal referral that required a documented response. Whatever else happened, the analyst who had filed that query 4 years ago would now know, if they were in a position to know anything about this ruling, that someone had found what they wrote and that it had carried weight. Page 5 addressed the non-escalation violation. The Chamber confirmed that the Trade Directorate's extension of the reauthorization interval from 90 to 60 days, issued 6 weeks after my challenge was filed, constituted a direct violation of the Accord's non-escalation provision. This was a separate finding from the primary ruling. It meant the Chamber had considered not just the 6-year history of the restrictions, but the Assembly's conduct during the challenge period itself. Page 6 addressed the remedy question. The Chamber granted the retrospective determination request and ordered the extension reversed immediately. All conditions were to be restored to their pre-extension status pending full implementation of the ruling's primary direction. Page 7 was the primary direction, 3 paragraphs. I read each one twice. The Chamber ordered that all lane management protocol requirements currently applied to Earth-registered provisional status shipping operators were hereby suspended pending full legislative review. The Assembly's Trade Directorate was required to present a corrective legislative proposal to the full Assembly Chamber within 120 days. Until that proposal was properly ratified through the full legislative process, no reauthorization requirements of any kind could be imposed on Earth shipping operators under any Directorate-level instrument. Not reduced requirements, not alternative requirements under a different name or a different reference number. None at all. Page 8 directed the Trade Directorate to commission an independent audit of all fees collected from Earth-registered operators under the protocol across the full 6-year period of application. The audit results were due within 180 days, and the Chamber would issue a separate determination on financial remedy based on those results. That was the retrospective financial question, the one that involved the 4.2 billion credits the filing's appendix had documented, now made a formal matter for independent audit and Chamber determination. Page 9 was the one that I sat with longest. The Chamber, on its own initiative and without any request from me, ordered a mandatory review of all administrative instruments currently applied to provisional status civilizations across all Assembly members, to assess whether any other directives had been issued without proper legislative ratification. The review was to be conducted by an independent panel, appointed jointly by the Office of Legal Standards and the Institute of Constitutional Affairs, and was to be completed within 2 years. I stopped reading at the end of that paragraph and looked at the wall for a moment. That paragraph was not about Earth. It was not about 47 cargo operators or reauthorization fees or transit corridor access. It was about every provisional status civilization the Assembly had ever placed a Directorate-level administrative instrument upon without going through the proper legislative process. Every world in that situation. Every set of restrictions, requirements, or obligations that had been applied through administrative practice rather than properly ratified law. The Chamber had taken one regulatory filing about 47 independent operators and used it to order a review of the entire framework by which the Assembly managed its relationships with worlds it had not yet fully admitted to membership. One correctly stated legal principle, followed without deviation to its logical conclusion, reaching everything the principle logically touched. I went back to reading. Pages 10 through 14 were technical appendices, implementation timelines, procedural mechanics for the legislative proposal process, terms of reference for the Audit Commission. I read them all carefully because the practical meaning of a ruling often lives in the appendices, and I had learned over 11 years that the most important clause in any legal document could sometimes be found on the last page in a subsection that appeared to be administrative housekeeping. On the final page, below the Chamber's formal seal, there was a personal note appended by Adjudicator Cavell. Such notes were not required in Assembly rulings and were rarely included. When they were included, they were usually brief. This one was 3 paragraphs. Cavell wrote that the Chamber wished to place on record its observation that the challenge had been prepared with a level of documentary rigor and constitutional precision uncommon in proceedings of this nature. He wrote that the Chamber had reviewed a large number of regulatory challenges and external filings in its collective history, and that the research depth and sourcing discipline of this filing placed it in a small category of submissions that had required the Chamber to genuinely reconsider its understanding of the matters under review rather than simply adjudicating between competing interpretations. He wrote that the Chamber considered it a matter of institutional importance that the Assembly's own founding documents had been carefully studied and correctly applied by a petitioner acting, without legal representation, in what the Chamber acknowledged had been a structurally unequal proceeding. He wrote that access to the founding documents at the Meridian Station Archive was legally available to all parties, but that the practical barriers of time, resources, and institutional knowledge meant that such access was rarely exercised by external parties. He said the Chamber was aware that this created an asymmetry in how the Assembly's own rules were understood and applied, and that this ruling was an opportunity to begin addressing that asymmetry. He wrote that the Chamber hoped this ruling would serve as a reminder that the Assembly's founding commitments to non-member and provisional status civilizations were not administrative courtesies extended at the discretion of member bodies. They were constitutional obligations, as binding as any other clause in the founding documents, and as enforceable through the proper channels by any party who understood how those channels worked and took the time to use them correctly. I read all 3 paragraphs twice, then I closed the document. I told Callum to send formal notifications to all 47 operators on the case file. I told him to inform them that the challenge had been decided in their favor on all primary points, and that detailed follow-up on the implementation timeline and audit process would follow. I told him to use formal language and the office's official communication channel. He said he would do it immediately. He asked if there was anyone I wanted to call. I called my supervisor first. He answered on the second ring. I told him the ruling had come in. I told him the Chamber had found in favor of the challenge on all primary points. The restrictions were suspended. A financial audit had been ordered, and the Chamber had additionally required a mandatory review of all directorate-level instruments applied to provisional status civilizations across all Assembly members. He was silent for a long time. Then he said he was sorry he had laughed when I first mentioned the filing. I told him not to worry about it. I said it had been a reasonable response, given what things looked like from the outside at the time. He laughed differently this time, the way people laugh when something has exceeded what they were prepared to imagine. He asked how I had been certain they could not simply absorb the challenge and let it disappear quietly. I said because I had read the documents. I said that was the complete answer. The documents said what they said. The filing repeated it back in a way that could not be set aside without setting aside the founding language itself. The outcome had been written into the founding conference records 60 years before I found them in the archive on Meridian Station. I had simply been the person who read those records carefully enough to see what was there and understand what it meant. He asked what I was going to do now. I looked out the window. The city was exactly as it had always been, cargo pods drifting on their regular routes. A vendor at his cart 2 blocks down, the same cart in the same spot every Tuesday since I had started working in this building. I told him I was going to finish the query I had been reviewing when the ruling arrived. Arthur Cole, a small outer lane operator with a freight classification dispute that a poorly worded administrative update had caused. It was a straightforward matter. He deserved a proper answer. My supervisor said that sounded exactly like me. After the call, I sat quietly at my desk. I thought about the founding conference volumes at the Meridian Station archive with their slightly yellowed pages, and the margin notes the original drafters had added in handwriting that had faded to a pale brown. I thought about the analyst at the Trade Directorate who had asked the right question 4 years ago and received nothing but silence. I thought about 47 families who ran cargo vessels on routes the Assembly had been making unnecessarily difficult for 6 years, who had pooled their filing fees and trusted a regulatory coordinator who told them something could be done. I thought about the mandatory review the Chamber had ordered on its own initiative. That was the part that would last the longest, not the suspension of the restrictions on Earth's operators, not the financial audit, not even the legislative proposal process. The mandatory review of every administrative instrument applied to every provisional status civilization across all Assembly members. That review would take 2 years. Its findings would go on record. Whatever it found would require action. And it had come from one filing made on behalf of 47 shipping operators, built out of documents that had been sitting in a public archive for 60 years waiting for someone to read them. Callum knocked on my door frame shortly after. He said all 47 notifications had gone out and that replies were already arriving. He read me pieces of what they said. Short messages, some formal and some not. A few of them were only a sentence or two long. They all said essentially the same thing. Thank you. One message was from a woman who ran a 2-vessel family operation and had been among the first to join the coalition. She wrote that she had not believed it would work. She said her husband had told her they had nothing to lose by trying. She said she was going to frame the notification. I said that was very kind. I asked Callum to file the ruling document in the case record and prepare a summary brief for the office archive. I said to mark the case as resolved pending audit follow-up. He said he would. He stood at my door for a moment. He said he had worked with me for 3 years and had watched me do work that looked very ordinary from the outside. And that today he understood why I had always been more focused on it than anyone else he had worked with. I said I appreciated that. He asked one final thing. He asked what I would have done if the ruling had gone the other way. I told him I would have identified which part of the Chamber's reasoning I believed was in error and determined whether an appropriate appellate pathway existed. I said the filing was correct. If the ruling had been wrong, the correct response would have been to find and follow the next correct step. That was all there ever was to it. The next correct step. He nodded. He went back to his desk. I went back to Arthur Cole's freight classification query and finished the response. I read it over once, made one small revision, and sent it. I noted the time in the case log. I closed the research terminal. I put my annotated copy of the filing in the lower drawer of my desk, where it had lived for the past 14 weeks. The case still had steps ahead of it. The audit results, the legislative proposal, the broader review panel and its 2-year process. There would be more documents to read and more responses to file, and I would handle each one as it arrived. I picked up my briefcase. I turned off the desk lamp. I said goodnight to Callum on my way out. The transit pod home was quiet. The city moved past the window in the late afternoon light, long shadows across the ground below. Somewhere on the other side of the city, in the Assembly's building made of dark gray stone and polished metal, people were beginning the work of implementing a ruling that required them to look closely at a great many things they had not examined in a long time. That work would be difficult, and it would take years, and I did not envy them the scale of it. I got off at my stop. I walked home. I made dinner and sat by the window for a while before bed, watching the city lights come up through the evening. I thought about the envelope with the green wax seal that had arrived under my door one morning, and the assumption behind it. The assumption that a mid-level coordinator with no legal staff and no institutional backing would look at the crest of the Interstellar assembly pressed into that wax and understand what it meant and withdraw. I had understood what it meant. I had simply understood something else as well, something they had not considered when they sent it. The assembly's own words, read carefully and applied correctly, were more powerful than any seal that any body could press into wax. Not because words were inherently stronger than institutions, but because these particular words had been written by the people who built the institution, and they had written them precisely so that they could not be quietly set aside when they became inconvenient. 31 days ago, 9 adjudicators had sat on a raised platform above a single table and waited to see what the person at that table was going to do. He had handed them a document. That was all, that was enough.